50 women on their knees, candlelight catching on polished marble, cardinals and princes seated in silence. In the center, a bride whose life had never belonged to her, and a groom ordered to prove a union not once but 3 times before an audience that included the Pope himself. That, according to contemporaries, is the image that haunted Europe. A wedding in the Vatican turned into a public ritual of humiliation, a spectacle of power, and a stain on the papal throne. This is the scene that contemporaries described from the Borgia's Rome at the turn of the 16th century, an era when family ties, military men, and ecclesiastical authority braided into a single, often brutal system of rule. The date of that night varies across sources. Some place the event in the autumn of 1502. Others provide slightly different datings in later copies, so historians debate the exact calendar entry. But the core of the testimony survives in the notes of the papal master of ceremonies, Juan Burchard, and in dispatches sent by foreign ambassadors. They recorded a night at the Vatican where private union was made public, where a marriage was sealed in view of onlookers as an act of domination rather than devotion. To understand how a wedding could become such a spectacle, one must first see the Borgias at the height of their power. Rodrigo Borgia sat on the papal throne as Alexander VI. He wielded the keys of St. Peter not only as a spiritual office, but as a tool of dynastic politics. Cesar Borgia, his son, combined the ambitions of a Renaissance prince with the ruthlessness of a military commander. For them, alliances were forged by marriage, and marriages were instruments of policy, sometimes negotiated, sometimes demanded. The papacy, in their hands, became as much a household dynasty as it was an institution of the church. Into this web stepped Lucrezia Borgia, the daughter, repeatedly married and remarried, not as a partner, but as a political token. Lucrezia's life had already been shaped by necessity and rumor. Her first marriage was annulled. Her second husband, Alfonso of Aragon, was murdered under circumstances that remained suspect and whispered about in many courts. By the time of the union with Alfonso d'Este, she had become a figure at once prized for the alliance she brought, and vulnerable because she represented the bargaining chip of a family that trusted few outside its inner circle. Alfonso d'Este arrived in Rome as an ally and a bargaining partner, also, by most accounts, a man who understood he stood under the shadow of papal demands. Contemporary records show that his arrival was not purely celebratory. Ambassadors reported pressure, veiled threats about the precarious position of Ferrara, and the presence of Caesar's men as a reminder that refusal could carry consequences. Whispers followed Alfonso through the apostolic palace.
Servants noted unusual preparations, rooms closed to usual guests, extra staff bustling through corridors, and a discreet but determined effort to keep certain plans from spreading beyond the inner suite. Juan Burchard, who oversaw ceremonies and kept a detailed diary of the papal household, wrote with the careful attention of a court functionary who could hardly ignore an event staged on such a scale. His entries and the dispatches of foreign envoys, especially those from Venice, offer the clearest windows into what happened that night. Still, readers should bear in mind that many of the most sensational elements of the account come from partisan sources. Later historians have disputed numbers and motivations, even as they accept the episode's broad outlines. The banquet itself began as a feast of Renaissance display. Musicians played in galleries, tapestries softened stone walls, and tables groaned under silver and roasted meats. The smell of spiced wine mixed with candle smoke. The guest list was a who's who of Rome's power brokers, cardinals in brocade, foreign ambassadors in embroidered doublets, soldiers polished like armor. For those present, the evening was supposed to mark a political union that could alter regional alliances. Instead, it was the prelude to a staged humiliation. According to contemporary witnesses, the mood changed abruptly. A retinue of women, reports often give the number as around 50, though that figure is debated, entered the hall. They were not presented as noble guests. The accounts described them as courtesans, summoned for a purpose other than entertainment. Without descending into lurid detail, these sources say that the women were made to perform a degrading display. On the marble floor they crawled, gathering chestnuts or other small objects in an act that invited comparisons to servitude and spectacle. The visual was deliberate, gilded surroundings, sacred sculptures as a backdrop, high-ranking clergy watching. Some attendants averted their eyes, others murmured but did not intervene. Guards were posted at doors to seal the chamber against any escape. Moments like this expose how the line between public ritual and private crime can be erased under authority. A wedding, ordinarily a private consummation of vows, was converted into an act staged by those who saw themselves above law and piety. The chestnut game, whether exactly 50 women, whether a chestnut or another device, becomes emblematic in the testimonies of larger dynamics, the transformation of a sacred sacrament into a demonstration of dominance. What followed was the most disturbing detail recorded by those same observers: the marriage consummation ordered and supervised in public view, reportedly performed not once but 3 separate times. Juan Burchard's diary, alongside the letters that circulated from Rome to other courts, conveyed outrage and incredulity. They described a father on the papal throne issuing an order, a son ensuring compliance, and a groom subjected to a ritual intended less to sanctify than to seal allegiance. When these claims are read today, it is essential to separate what the sources say from what historians can prove. The notion that the groom was forced to perform in public 3 times is recorded in several contemporary accounts, but the exact staging, the precise commands, and the motivations behind the repetition are debated. Some historians argue that later retellings amplified the spectacle as a way to caricature the Borgias. Others accept the essence of the record and interpret the repetition as a deliberate legal-seeming act intended to remove doubt about the marriage's legitimacy. Either way, the repetition, first course, second course, final act, served the Borgias' objective: to leave no possible question that the alliance had been consummated in a manner that could be invoked in treaties, claims, and political narratives. To imagine the sequence without sensationalizing it, the first act, according to reports, produced stunned silence. The groom and bride were compelled into a public demonstration that turned intimacy into an arena. For those who watched, disbelief gave way to a cold calculation. Some observers, noting the presence of soldiers and the papal family's power, understood that protest could be deadly. After an interval, witnesses record a second iteration, more mechanical, more stripped of any pretense of consent. The third, according to accounts, arrived as dawn neared, a final, ritualistic confirmation that the marriage had been achieved and that the conditions the Borgias demanded, political and symbolic, had been fulfilled. Why 3 times? The repeated act had legal and rhetorical significance in an age when ritual could seal legitimacy. In a court where papal favor decided territories and titles, a public witnessing of a union could allay future claims of impropriety or nullity. It could also function as a spectacle of subjugation, a clear message to would-be resistors that consent could be manufactured under pressure and that the papal house would convert private bodies into instruments of policy. Not everyone in the palace watched with indifference. Burchard's notes reveal unease. Ambassadors' letters, especially those dispatched to Venice and other republics, conveyed horror mixed with calculation. Reports moved rapidly through European networks. In some courts, the tale became proof positive of corruption perched atop Rome, a narrative eagerly seized by critics of papal authority. It is important to emphasize that these reactions were shaped by political rivalries as much as by moral outrage. The Borgias had enemies who would gladly propagate stories that would weaken their credibility. Yet multiple independent witnesses documented episodes that, while perhaps exaggerated in later retellings, cohere around a broadly consistent claim that a wedding had been manipulated into a spectacle serving the family's political ends. The immediate aftermath in Rome was not simply gossip. Ambassadors filed dispatches that reached princely courts, and merchants and clerics exchanged murmurs that hardened into reputational damage. In an age when papal image mattered for alliances and spiritual authority, the Borgia household's actions fed a growing chorus of discontent. Scholars who chart the causes of the Protestant Reformation and other movements for change often point to episodes like this as evidence, among many others, of the moral rot perceived in the highest offices. Martin Luther and other later critics invoked the Borgias as an emblem of papal corruption, using such stories to argue that the institution needed reform. That does not mean that the Reformation was caused by a single scandal, but scandals of the Roman court, widely reported and repeatedly remembered, contributed to a climate of suspicion and demand for accountability. For the people most intimately involved, the consequences were personal and long-lasting. Alfonso d'Este carried the weight of the night forward. Foreign accounts suggest that he was humiliated and traumatized by the experience, forced into a public role that left him uneasy and distant. Lucrezia, the bride at the center of the spectacle, emerged from the event with a reputation shaped by other people's narratives. To many contemporaries, she was a pawn, a woman whose marriages served strategic ends, who endured betrayal and loss in the name of dynastic stability. Later in life, as Duchess of Ferrara, Lucrezia cultivated a different image: patron of the arts, protector of culture, and a figure who sought to exercise agency within the tight constraints imposed on noble women of her era. Her charities and cultural patronage complicate the caricature that history has sometimes offered. The human cost she paid, however, was the enduring stigma and the trauma of being treated publicly as an instrument. Cesar Borgia's role in these events hardens the story's political dimension. Known for his military campaigns and for his willingness to use brutality to consolidate power, Cesar embodied the coercive side of the Borgia project. Where Alexander's papal office provided the moral and legal veneer for decisions, Caesar's force supplied the means of enforcement. When witnesses describe guards posted to keep doors closed, or when they write of a son ensuring that an order from the papal throne was carried out, they are describing a marriage enacted under the shadow of a militarized family strategy. What then do historians make of the testimony? Scholars do not present a single agreed-upon reading.
Some treat Burchard's diary and ambassadorial letters as credible primary sources that, though not free from political coloring, reflect what happened in the papal apartments. Others caution that the more lurid elements, precise numbers of women, the theatrical choreography, or the exact number of repetitions, may have been exaggerated in both contemporary gossip and later retellings. A critical historian will point out where the record is thin and where later narratives amplified scandal for polemical purposes. A different kind of reader will focus on the common threads across sources: the use of marriage as a tool, the presence of coercion, and the conversion of a private right into a public demonstration of power. Whatever the strict historical truth in every granular detail, the episode's impact on reputation and memory is easier to trace. Letters between ambassadors sent to their rulers, courtly gossip that spread across dynastic networks, and the accounts of moralists in Northern Europe all carried the image of the Vatican transformed into a theater of moral decline. That image proved durable. It followed the Borgias after Alexander's death, and it helped to shape a durable narrative about how absolute power, when unchecked, can instrumentalize bodies and rights for political ends. The ethical reading of this event is raw and immediate. It reveals an abuse of power that targeted the vulnerable. It foregrounds the way institutions can mask coercion with ceremony, using ritualized acts to justify outcomes that justice and conscience would otherwise condemn. The spectacle of a wedding used as a political tool is not merely a scandal. It is a warning about how authority can pervert the most intimate human gestures into mechanisms of control. Historians who have sought to place Lucrezia's life in fuller context remind us that she was more than the sum of the scandals attributed to her. She later ruled in Ferrara with a degree of independence, fostering an artistic court that attracted poets, painters, and scholars. Some modern scholars have worked to disentangle the woman from the slanders and to read her life as one of constrained agency rather than simple complicity. But disentangling reputations is a slow process, and episodes like the Vatican wedding, powerful, salacious in the public imagination, and repeated in dispatches, left marks that no later patronage could entirely erase. There are also broader institutional lessons. The Vatican's moral authority relied on sacred symbolism and trust. When those symbols were manipulated for political advantage, the damage extended beyond individuals into the credibility of the institution itself. Critics of the papacy in the 16th century used such stories as evidence that spiritual leadership had been corrupted by worldly ambitions.
Whether one sees the Borgias as the main cause of later reform movements or as one striking example among many, the sequence of events demonstrates how scandal can metastasize from household misbehavior to widespread institutional distrust. If you want to explore more buried episodes of Vatican history, subscribe for deeper dives into the archives and eyewitness accounts that historians still puzzle over. The documentary record also invites a kind of methodological humility. Primary sources like Juan Burchard's diary must be read both as windows and as artifacts. They report what an observer noticed, but they also carry the observer's perspective. Ambassadors wrote to advantage their rulers' political aims, sometimes sharpening scandal to make a persuasive case for intervention or caution. Later historians, with access to broader archives, have both confirmed elements of the story and questioned parts that seem disproportionate or uncorroborated. Where the record is unequivocal, names, dates of certain marriages, political consequences, historians can be confident. Where the spectacle becomes theatrical in description, caution is warranted. This is why responsible retelling anchors sensational claims to their sources. Juan Burchard recorded that an ambassador reported. Contemporary dispatches say, phrases that remind listeners we are reconstructing events from testimony rather than reading an objective transcript of what transpired. And yet, even the most cautious account must reckon with the effect the event had on contemporary imaginations. The tale of a wedding consumed by spectacle became shorthand for the moral vulnerabilities of a court that mixed sacral office with dynastic lust. For reformers and critics abroad, the narrative functioned as both evidence and metaphor. A marriage that should have been private instead became a public sign of sacrilege and moral decay. That symbolic power outlived the papacy that staged it. It shaped letters, sermons, and political judgments across Europe. What of the people who survived the night? Alfonso d'Este returned to Ferrara bearing the mark of the humiliation. His later life, the political relations he maintained, and the distance he reportedly kept from his wife are the kinds of human traces that suggest an event's psychic cost. Lucrezia's later decades show her attempting to anchor herself in patronage and governance. Her later reputation, while layered with controversy, demonstrates that a life reduced to a scandal can still produce acts of dignity and cultural contribution. But dignity regained cannot fully erase trauma experienced in a room where power turned intimacy into display. To the question implied in the title, 3 times in one night, while everyone watched, history provides both answers and caveats. Contemporary testimonies attest to a repetitive public consummation staged under papal auspices. Those testimonies were heard across Europe and used politically.
Yet, scholars remind us to treat details with caution. The number of women, the exact choreography, and some of the most lurid aspects are reported in sources that may have had motive to shock. Still, whether every detail stands up to modern standards of verification, the moral core of the accusation survives. The Borgias converted a private right into public dominion, and in doing so, damaged personal lives and the papacy's public standing. This episode sits at the intersection of spectacle and sovereignty. It asks us to consider how moral authority is vulnerable when its symbols are exploited, how women and subordinate men can be made instruments of dynastic policy, and how spectacle can be weaponized to eliminate doubt. It reminds us how quickly ritual can be perverted when those with the power to command view human bodies as tools rather than as persons. For listeners who want to go deeper, the primary documents remain the most compelling route. Juan Burchard's diary entries from the papal household, the diplomatic dispatches sent by Venetian and other ambassadors, and later commentaries by critics and historians provide the raw material for judgments about what occurred and why. Reading those sources with an eye to both context and motive allows a more nuanced view than simple scandalmongering. It also enables the reader to see how political rivalry, familial ambition, and institutional prerogative combined in ways that altered lives and reputations. History does not offer easy closure. The Borgias, for all their notorious deeds, were also actors in a world where patronage, military force, and family strategy were the currencies of survival. That fact does not excuse abuses. Rather, it explains the structural conditions that made abuse possible and, in some eyes, inevitable. The night in the Vatican, whether reconstructed in every detail or remembered in broad strokes, stands as a case study in how power can be performed and how performance can be used to legitimize the illegitimate. In the end, the image that endures is not merely of a marriage sealed 3 times in public. It is of a moment when the sacred and the profane crossed a line so visibly that witnesses felt compelled to write it down, to tell rulers abroad, and to remember it for generations. That testimony, however colored by politics, helped to shape a larger narrative about the Church and its leadership at a pivotal moment in European history. It moved beyond rumor to become a symbol, a cautionary tale about how accumulation of power without accountability corrodes both private lives and public trust. If this account surprised you or unsettled you, the primary sources are worth consulting. Look up Juan Burchard's diary entries and the embassy dispatches from Rome to Venice and other courts.
They are the starting points for anyone who wants to weigh the evidence for themselves and to see how contemporaries interpreted a night that many later remembered as emblematic of a papal household gone awry. Comment Borgia if you made it to the end, and tell us which part of this story you want us to unpack next. Source analysis, Lucrezia's later years in Ferrara, or the political aftermath in Renaissance Europe.